How are Aussie supermarkets changing our expectations when shopping online?
And why are telco complaints on the downswing? Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support.
Hi there. Welcome back to Vertical Hold Behind the Tech News, the award-winning tech podcast where we catch up with Australia's leading tech journalists to dive into the big stories of the week. I'm Alex Kidman, joined as usual by Adam Turner. Hey Adam, this week our old friend Elon Musk saw his net value drop by, wait for it, a chunky $13 billion in one day.
Ouch.
13 billion is a lot to lose. What lengths would you go to in order to recover that kind of cash?
I reckon I'd start by pulling my head out of my ass and stop trying to destroy the thing that I just spent a shitload of money to buy. I think that'd be a good starting point before you did anything else.
Have you seen Elon Musk? I mean, it
Yes,
doesn't
I
seem
know.
likely
No.
he's going to take that advice.
That is
Adam.
asking a lot.
It's just a thought, but I think it's not terribly likely.
I realize that is asking a lot, but it would be a first step.
It would be a good first step, I think, too. Also joining us in the virtual Vertical Hold studios from Finder, it's Angus Kidman. Gus, if you lost $13 billion, where do you reckon it'd be?
Down the boozer?
That was my second guess.
That's a lot of gin and tonics, sir. I mean, a lot.
As Dan says, let's get on the beers.
Gus is not, in fact, joining us to get on the beers, although that does sound like an excellent idea. He's instead joining us because this week the TIO, the Telecommunication Industry Ombudsman, has put out its quarterly report on telco performance. And before you fall asleep in the back there, I see you. It's got some surprising results within it. But first, Gus is also joining us because this week, Coles announced it's opening up online click and collect orders with a 60-minute delivery window. And having been one of the first to trial online supermarket shopping in Australia, and I'm not making this up, having won awards for a story where he flew to Melbourne to collect ice cream from a locker, we reckon he's a bit of an expert in the field. Gus, actually, before we get into the story of what Coles is doing, tell us about the first online shopping, first online supermarket shopping in Australia. When was this? Why was this?
So this was, it was longer ago than you'd think. It was in about 1998 that Woolworths first had a serious go at this. There had been a couple of tiny startups who'd done this before that, but Woolies are the first one to really get into it and say, hey, we're actually going to try out this newfangled delivery thing. And by a fantastic coincidence, the one supermarket they tried it in the whole of Australia was my local Woolies at the time.
Were you wearing an onion on your belt?
No, I ordered the onions, Adam. That was the whole point of doing the online shopping. So they can
Ordering onions via dial-up, I'm guessing.
Ooh.
I think maybe by that point I'd managed to get. That was also during the brief window when I actually had what would have been one of the first cable internet connections. So,
Ooh, fancy.
When you say
with
fancy,
like a 1 gig monthly cap or something like that, or
something like that. It wasn't fancy. It was Optus. So
the old rolling caps where you just had to make sure that everybody used so much that nobody got kicked off.
Absolutely. So back then it was pretty simple and pretty basic, and yeah, it has evolved a lot. And now suddenly we've arrived in this world where Coles has said, "Hey, we might actually deliver you your shopping within an hour after you've ordered it." Yeah.
So are they going to rock up you at the front door with your groceries, or do you need to go and pick them up?
At this stage, you still need to go and pick them up. They haven't got a big enough delivery workforce to actually guarantee they're going to get it. So the time you're saving is essentially, okay, I don't have to run in and grab it. And they're giving you a bigger range of things to do it with. The big boast in their announcement is, hey, you can order a hot chook, which they didn't let you do previously because they were worried about the botulism that was going to kick in if it sat around in the car for too long, I imagine. So,
can you order ice cream?
I believe you can order ice cream. I think ice cream's in there. Yes, obviously.
That's not going to sit well with the hot chook.
No, it's not. That's what I'm worried about.
Have you not tried a hot chicken sundae? It's absolutely delicious.
Fine words from a vegetarian there.
Fair call.
I'm curious though. Have they said, because I mean, you wander around a supermarket, and it does not necessarily have to be Coles, and this is not meant to be an ad for them. But you wander around just about any supermarket, and you will see teenagers shuffling around those huge kind of stacked trolley deals where they're rapidly adding things into them. Have they said much about their workforce? Are they just whipping them harder, or are they actually taking on extra people to do this?
I didn't see any announcement about extra people, and I do think this is
So
the
extra
hidden,
whipping then.
extra whipping. Yeah, the whipping will continue until morale improves. This is definitely the space that we've found ourselves in. There was a great piece in the conversation a couple of months ago discussing how the thing that supermarket workers hate most is when an urgent order comes in and this special bell goes off, and they're like, "Oh, I've got to get that done," because anybody who's looking for that delivery to boot service is looking for a fairly fast response. They're not normally doing it the day before, so. Yeah, there's no sense in which this is necessarily going to make the life of a supermarket worker any nicer than it was before, and it's just going to be one more thing to complain about when they substitute the wrong brand of tin tomatoes or whatever your particular objection is going to be.
One of the things that caught my eye is that customers can place an order for up to 40 items. Now, 40 items doesn't sound like enough for a weekly family shop. I mean, I looked at the receipt from our weekly grocery shop and it was about 60 items. Now, admittedly, there were multiples in there. If you took out the multiples, we might have got down closer to 40. But do you think they've maybe deliberately kept it a bit low to try and stop those, like a certain tier of customer using it?
I think that might be part of it, but I do think there are different expectations about how people shop. So I think when you're trying to stock up the Turner household with the 5,000 sides of ham and all the sausages and all the other barbecue items
Yes.
that you require, in that
Don't forget
context,
bacon.
yeah. In that context, where you're doing a really big spend, like there are two, you're either likely to want to do it yourself, or you're going to go for one of the you're ordering enough that they'll give you free delivery if you don't mind having a bit of flexibility on it. You have to pay extra for this service. And I think it is about, oh, I just want that quick satisfaction. There's a few urgent things I need. I really need them in an hour. Like, I think when you've got that planned out big weekly shop, that's not really what this is aimed at.
Yeah, but if you need a few urgent things within the next hour, it is honestly probably easier to just jump in the car and go to the supermarket because obviously you live close to the supermarket or they wouldn't be offering the service to you.
Well, I think it would be interesting to work out the distance. Yeah, I'm 5 minutes walk from my nearest Coles,
Yeah.
so there's no way that this would ever be remotely appealing to me, even in the
You
unlikely
also
event
don't
that I drive. I know. I was waiting for Alex to point that out, but yeah, but it's not. So, but I think I generally think there is a target space like in capital cities where people are sufficient distance that it's a pain to drive there. Maybe it's not that long as the crow flies, but maybe you've got to go through half a dozen red lights. Maybe I can see that there's obviously some appetite for this, and we have seen similar services and variations of them take off overseas. So there's definitely potential. The thing I would say about that, though, is that this idea of rapid delivery, Coles are the first big supermarket to try it. They're not the first player to try this in Australia. We've seen a bunch of, generally in inner urban areas, a bunch of services try and launch like this in Australia this year, trying to promise really rapid delivery on essentials. And what's interesting is that a bunch of them have fallen over. They've already gone bust. Or they've drastically scaled back their service. So Volley went bust completely. Milk Run went from 10-minute delivery to, oh, we'll be quick, but we're not promising how quick.
So these were all startups, though. These weren't established supermarkets.
No, and I think this is the thing. I think one of the things we know about Australia is that it's actually very hard for those remote for these kind of things to scale in the same way. So something that works really well because it looks good in New York and London just doesn't translate over here. And also, we have an incredibly concentrated grocery sector. Like we basically, Woolworths and Coles collectively, it's something like 80% of the market is between the two of those, and then the rest is kind of split between IGA and Aldi, basically. So they have an awful lot of power, so they can afford to play around with this, lose a bit of money, work out how to make some cash out of it, and in the meantime, anyone smaller trying to do it is really not going to take off.
So, Gus, you mentioned in the intro that you happen to be lucky enough to be in the one area where Woolies tried it 24 odd years ago, or whatever it was. Do we know how many stores this is? Is my local likely to be it, or is it the case of, oh, we've got half a dozen of them, good luck?
No, it's much more scaled than that. It's been announced as already available in 400 stores, with another 200 getting out on early next year. Now, that's certainly not every Coles supermarket, and I get that all the ones that aren't on that list are the ones that are actually in regional areas.
Yeah.
This feels like a city play, but again, let's not forget that that's where Australians live. They all live in large cities. No one actually lives in rural areas, proportionally speaking. It's a very small. Sorry to offend all our rural listeners, but this is the reality.
The thing is, though, I guess if you're in one of those little regional centres, they could well be some of those 400 stores, and you may well be able to still do that 60-minute to boot because you happen to be in town. If you live, 100k out of town on a farm, yeah, you're probably used to things taking a bit longer to get there.
Well, in theory, you've got an hour to drive to the supermarket.
There is that too.
Yeah.
And I was going to say the other use case that occurs to me is for city workers jumping on a train. Just before I leave work, I throw this order through to say, right, well, I know I'll hit the station in 45 minutes at the other end of my train trip. Takes me 10 minutes to drive to Coles, and then I'll pick up my groceries. I don't have to go in. There's a use case there as well. The other thought that strikes me, Gus, you mentioned the whole concentration of supermarket shopping, and there's a semi-elephant in the room here in the form of Amazon.
Isn't there always?
But we know that Amazon's done Amazon Fresh in the States, and I think the UK to a limited extent as well. And they've done some grocery stuff here, and they've done kind of a convergence of some same-day shopping stuff as well. Do you think the likes of Coles and Woolies see them as a threat in this sector?
I think they're aware that potentially they could because they've got very deep pockets. So, Amazon has experimented with this. It does have limited same day delivery if you order before a certain time and for certain categories of products coming out of its own warehouse. I've tried this out. It does work, but it's
with food, or did you order a physical non-food item?
I ordered a physical non-food item, but food is included in that. Like there is stuff that's within it. I will say it's an example. They want to be able to boast that they've got it, but then they have a dark pattern that stops you from using it. Because they highlight it when you're ordering, but then the default selection is next day delivery, which is cheaper for them rather than same day delivery. So they're playing around with it. At the moment, too, the food stocks that Amazon have, it's very much in the packaged sector.
So it's not fresh food. That's
fresh is not coming in at all. It's all stuff in cans and in some bulk, which kind of makes sense if you're going to get it delivered that way. They are aggressive in the sense that every week when the Woolies catalogue comes out and the Coles catalogue comes out, they price match for every single thing that's in their warehouse to the same price as those specials, and they're not negotiating the actual specials the way that the supermarkets are. So they're
just sucking up the difference because they figure they'll make it up in the long tail of you using them for other things.
So they're definitely loss leading into it. So I do think this is one of the reasons why Coles is playing around with this and why I expect that Woolies will do it as well, because they are aware that Amazon is a big-pocketed competitor that's prepared to put up with some fairly substantial losses for a while it gets a footing into the market. So, you're going to continue to see these kind of battles playing out between those three, and then Aldi are going to go, nah, stuff you, we're not interested. Aldi tried out online delivery for its special buys earlier this year and then canned it. They decided that, okay, we don't need that hassle. We've got enough issues getting stuff in. Oh, sorry, I've got to realise that I should have pointed this out at the start of the show. Adam is this is a sneaky Adam plan, this whole topic, because we are talking about the supply chain here.
Oh my God. He got away with it.
Bazinga.
It's taken him 8.5 years, but he finally did it. He finally
I was going to spring that on him right at the end, but you're right.
Here we are in supply chain tech universe. But we're going to see this demand continue. I mean, we know from Finder Consumer Research that the biggest complaint people have of any form of online shopping is how long it takes to get stuff. Like, we're impatient. Now that we're used to buying stuff online, we want it quicker. We also want to beat up Australia Post, but that's a separate discussion topic. But
Well, I was going to say, I'm someone who has used online supermarket shopping. It was quite invaluable when I had COVID earlier in the year because obviously I couldn't go out. But I'm a sample size of one. Do we have a picture of how popular online supermarket shopping is in general, not just click and collect kind of stuff, but also delivery?
It has, as you'd expect, it rapidly grew in the last 2 years because suddenly everyone went, hey, this is a good idea. I can't remember the figures off the top of my head, but I seem to recall that the Roy Morgan data shows something like it doubled. Like the number of people who are doing it is like, it's definitely increased. And of course, the supermarkets, they feel like they've got a base there. Everybody who's got a Flybuys card or a Everyday Rewards card is also kind of their grist to that mill. They're already partly signed up into the supermarket. So it's a significant chunk. It's big enough now that they're opening dozens of so-called dark stores, the supermarkets that are purely for delivery and only have staff in them and don't have any actual customers going in and paying for stuff.
Now, I buy a bit of stuff on Amazon. I don't tend to buy food, but one thing I bought on Amazon a few times is coffee. And I noticed that they're very keen to say, hey, if you want to make this a regular order, we'll give you a discount, maybe once a month or once every 2 months, and we'll knock 10 or 20% off it. Is that the kind of thing that we're seeing from the other providers as well? And does Amazon offer that far and wider? Or is it just something you see every now and then?
Amazon offers it on quite a lot of its food items. Of course, it's the Australian basic version of the fancy thing they had with, the button that you could have sitting in your
Yeah.
laundry, and every time you ran out of stuff, you just pressed it. We haven't
Until
got
your
to that.
toddler got hold of it and went bang, 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 and
Yeah.
4,000 gallons of washing up liquid arrived.
And then you said, "Hey Alexa, cancel my order." Yeah, that was it. Was very like that. So no, they do that on quite a lot of things. And in fact, one of the most popular recurring tips on discount communities like Ozbargain is, "Hey, tell Amazon that this is going to be a recurring order, so you get another 10% off. Then cancel as soon as the first one arrives." We don't have that direct model going on with Woolworths and Coles, but they do make a big play on saying, hey, you can set up a list of your basic list of the stuff you want every time, and you can copy that over easily. They're definitely much better at making it easy to pick those things out and suggesting things and highlighting the stuff you bought last time that was on special. So they're leaning into that. But there hasn't been a lot of broad experimentation with that. Which is not to say they're not trying it somewhere, because they do a lot of experiments and they test out different versions of these loyalty products to try and keep people shopping all the time.
Yeah, well, they definitely differentiate out their specials categories front and center to try and get you to click on them and do those kinds of impulse purchases, because you go, oh, hang on, that's half off. I'll have one of those, which I guess is their play towards it, but obviously probably a more profitable play than them saying, we will always give you 10% off coffee.
Yeah, they're not quite ready to dive into that space. And of course, their negotiations are a lot more complex, because supermarket profitability still depends on those relationships with manufacturers. So we're back in supply chain again. I'm excited.
Huzzah!
Yeah, there is this sense that supermarkets have this very complex thing where they get the special discounted prices in return for providing things like end of supermarket appearances, where things are on the end of the aisle and you're doing all that. Amazon haven't really got to that yet, although they do have promoted placements on their own site. So over time, we might expect to see that happening. But at this stage, they're leaning heavily into hey, we've got everything, we're convenient, we'll do all these things for you. Amazon is playing in the discount space because this is its established playbook. But this is how we win a market, is just by making stuff cheap.
Now, this is what we talked about with Aaron the other week. If you were selling tech, we'll say you were selling USB dongles on Amazon. Amazon will go, oh, they're selling well. I think we'll sell our own white label one. And when someone searches for yours, we'll put ours at the top. Now, supermarkets do the same by white labeling food. They lean on their suppliers and say, you've got to sell it to us at half price and we'll rack our name on it. Could you see Amazon doing the same thing in the food category and leaning on their suppliers to say, hey, we want that tomato sauce at a half price so we can whack a white label on it?
I think they'd like it eventually. They've done that. Their Amazon Basics line applies to all sorts of other non-food things. They haven't done it so much with food. And what I'd venture to suggest is they're not going to try it in the next couple of years, because world food supplies are so disrupted anyway. Like, food pricing generally is predicted to go up in Australia by 10% in the next year. So it's probably not the time when that strategy is going to be super effective for them. I wouldn't put them past giving a try at some point. I doubt Australia is going to be their guinea pig market for that. That's going to get rolled out in some weird suburb in San Francisco.
Well, speaking of guinea pig markets, I mean, Australia has been somewhat late to come to this party in certain respects, but where do we actually sit internationally? I mean, what models can we look at from Europe or the US or elsewhere on the planet where this might go in this particular online shopping scenario?
So I think we're somewhat mid tier on this stuff. We're not as advanced as Europe. We're still ahead of large other chunks of the region and other parts of the world. There are still models we really haven't seen take off, like in the UK, which is probably has a lot of similarities to the Australian market generally, and a lot of strategies that have been adapted from that market. The UK's really has seen a rise in the online thing, and they've got big brands like Ocado who are online only, like they've never had any other kind of presence. But they work really hard on the integration piece. Like, they do deals with recipe sites. So if you fancy a recipe, you just click a button and then Ocado delivers you all the ingredients in that recipe in one hit. And I think I can imagine that we'll start seeing actually versions of that coming from Coles and Woolworths. They both put a lot of effort into producing recipes. If you read a supermarket catalogue, 3 pages of that thing are recipes these days, which didn't used to be the case. And I can see that auto ordering off that is the next kind of little element that we could really be looking at. So there's definitely space for those things to change. But at the same time, supermarkets serve a big audience and people respond to change poorly. So for every person who's excited about this, there's someone who's going, I just want more people behind to checkout. I'm sick of having to check my own stuff out in the store. Yeah, I run into this.
Can I pay by check, please?
Yes, yeah. You see those people in every supermarket. So they want to be at the forefront of these things, but they're also, I think there's a real awareness of not scaring people with too much tech and too much change too quickly.
And finally, Gus, because I kind of mentioned this in the intro, but we didn't actually go into the details. Tell people about how and why you flew to Melbourne for ice cream.
So one of the other extension tests, and this was Coles again, they introduced a supermarket locker that was at Melbourne Airport. So the idea was that if you were late, you came in on a flight, you could order stuff, the day before or the morning before, pick it up. So that the idea again, it was a bit similar to what Adam was talking about earlier. You just pick it up on your way home. You're taking the car back home anyway, saves you stopping off at the supermarket on the way back. And they did promise they had these special things that were like, freezer friendly. So I thought, well, the thing you want to try out with a service like that is some ice cream. So I flew to Melbourne, ordered in the minimum order, which was $50. So, but mind you, you've bought Ben and Jerry's. That doesn't get you a whole lot of ice cream, as you said. And some puzzles to do on the way back and some travel toiletries, if I recall correctly, just to see if they could deliver them and if the ice cream was edible. And it was. I was surprised. It was generally in quite a good state. So I don't know where, and it's still there. Those things are still running. So, Adam, the next time that you fly back from one of your interstate jaunts, I think you owe it to the family to pick up a bunch of stuff from the Coles locker on the way through.
I think they'd be a bit disappointed if I came home with groceries and not Krispy Kreme donuts, though. I remember back in the day when they didn't have the Krispy Kreme donuts in Melbourne. And so when you got on a plane in Sydney, like the last flight to come home, everybody was getting on with the bloody 24-pack of Krispy Kreme donuts and putting them up above in the headspace. And then now that they're at Melbourne Airport, you don't see that anymore. But
Rated.
Yeah, but they were exciting because you brought them home on the plane, and my family would always get like, "Oh, Dad's bringing home donuts." But yeah, I think Dad's bringing home lettuce and tomato may not quite have the same ring to it.
I can neither confirm or deny that I may have deliberately put heavy bags on top of people's Krispy Kremes when they were on planes.
You're the one.
So here at Vertical Hold, we tend to complain quite a bit, but we complain with a good cause because we see something that's going wrong in tech and we want it fixed or we want it to be better. We're not the authority body on this, though. That, for a lot of Australians, tech is the TIO, the Telecommunications Industry Ombudsman. They're in charge of large-scale complaints around mobile and broadband services, and Australians historically have tended to complain about those a lot. The TIO has put out its latest quarterly report this week, but there's a bit of a swing change here, isn't there, Gus?
Yes, so surprisingly, the actual number of complaints has dropped. And this has been a trend for a while with the TIO, the last 2 or 3 quarters. I think we've seen this, but there's an ongoing sense that, okay, things aren't quite as bad because across most categories, we've seen things go down. So I think compared to this time last year, it went down 23.9%. The one that did stick out, like the new thing, and perhaps the unsurprising thing, is that for the first time, privacy complaints are in the top 5 things that people are complaining about. And we can sheet this completely to one brand and one brand alone, and that would be Optus. So remarkably,
people are complaining about Optus. Why?
Well, who could say? Who could say? But interesting. It's clear that in fact, the period that they're reporting on, only 1 week of that was the first week of when the Optus data breach was on. So even in that 1 week, it managed to get into the top 5. I would bet, Melbourne to a brick that in the next one, privacy is going to be the number 1 complaint, and Optus is going to be the most complained about by a country mile.
What I found interesting in the data as well was, and again, we've treated the NBN like our soup du jour on this show for the longest time, is that actual broadband complaints are very much in the minority. It's predominantly mobile complaints that people have. Is this just people finally kind of getting out of that work from home arrangement so their mobiles have become more important?
I would have thought it was just the NBN finally getting their shit together.
Well, it could be both. It could be both. Have they finally got their shit together?
I was going to say, sorry, Adam, am I on the right podcast? What claims are you making?
Relatively speaking. Relatively speaking. I mean, one of the benchmarks I go by is how often I get emails from people saying, I've been left with no broadband for months and no one can help me. And I read your article in the paper. Can you help me do something about it? I used to get them a few a week. I don't get them very often anymore. So that to me is one indication that things seem to be settling down.
Indeed, and to sheet the blame back to our favorite other thing to kick, I think a lot of that is to do with the fact that most of the Optus HFC cable has been retired and
Oh,
replaced with
yeah.
stuff that's slightly more fit for purpose. So I
I mean,
think
if,
slicing that out helps.
if only someone had told them up front it was no good. The look on the other two are just like, yes, I have no words.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of data here, and we could dive into a bunch of different angles with it. I found it interesting. One of the lower things, and this is something that does annoy me, frankly, is slow data speed. But it was something like 6% of complaints was slow data speed. People are slightly more satisfied with their data speeds. It would seem.
Well, maybe I think we're probably still. This is probably the long-term switch over from when basically there was again the NBN wholesale rules changed and suddenly everyone was on 50 or better. Like there's just,
Hmm.
I do think for an awful lot of people, 50 is going to do it pretty well. And I realize that neither of you gentlemen this will apply to, but you both have teenage children, so your needs are much greater
Yes.
than the average household. So I do. I think probably the percentage of people who were on a really slow speed and not doing it just because they just really wanted a cheap plan and just didn't want to get their landline. I just think that's moving on. So I do, yeah, it's a good thing. I guess it means that people are using those higher speeds, and maybe that means we'll no longer have this argument. Oh, nobody needed speeds that high. We always knew that was rubbish, but now we've got some evidence that people actually like the higher speeds.
It's not so much data speeds, but absolutely, especially for residential customers, the number one complaint is 51% of all the complaints they got for residential customers was what they called no or delayed action by provider. So this is going to your telco and saying, "Hey, do this, fix this," and they don't. Right?
Yeah. And well, that sounds like BAU for most telcos, I
Yes.
think. Honest, but I mean, we do know that these processes can be slow. Some of this is because of badly designed systems. Again, oh, I can kick the NBN again. This feels good. So one of those problems is, if you've got a problem with the NBN, you have to ring your service provider, and then basically they have to ring the NBN and see if someone's going to do anything about it. So the system has a built-in kind of delay. So I think that explains the broadband ones. For the mobile ones, it's more complicated, and in some cases, it may just come down to like the difficulty of getting hold of call centers in some instances, or their ability to do anything about certain problems. It's never a good moment when you've got to ring up your mobile provider. Like, there's never a moment where you say, "Well, that's going to be a fun morning where my problem will be cheerfully resolved by a helpful person." So that's when the booze comes out.
We used to hear a lot about black spot programs. They'd say, all right, we'll put an X million dollars into fixing these black spots. And sometimes they weren't in the middle of nowhere. They were quite close to the city centre. You don't hear about that so much anymore. Have the major telcos managed to plug a lot of those holes, you think, and maybe that's why some of the complaints are dropping off?
Could be, could be. I mean, I think the black spot program also of this. I think they'll come back again because we've been in a wave of there's 5G rollouts. Everyone goes, well, let's see what happens. Then you work out that the actual black spots have shifted a little bit. So I feel like
Yeah.
this is one of those. It's a bit of a sine wave function. At the same time, to some extent, I don't know how often a complaint about a black spot is going to end up in the TIO data because ultimately that's just
That's a
the
good
service
point.
just
Yeah.
Well,
the
so
service may not be there.
they do have some numbers. I've got them in front of me at the moment about that. 9% of their complaints were about poor mobile coverage. It was the fourth most
Okay.
popular, if you will, complaint that
Wait
they had.
until
But
they
it's
shut down 3G. Then you'll hear about it.
but I mean that's absolutely dwarfed by what was it? Resolution agreed but not met. So your telco agreed to do something but didn't do it. Service and equipment fees, so costs. That's something I think people are always going to complain about. And then we're back to no or delayed action by provider. Again, the provider didn't actually do something. So poor mobile coverage is still there, but it's certainly not a big, heavy thing for the mobile users ahead of costs or the provider just not
Yeah.
doing stuff.
Well, poor customer service is how you would summarize 2 or 3 days of
Yes,
using
true.
together. And inevitably the reason for that is because since all our lovely telco providers are all listed companies, they're just trying to look to cut costs. And when they're trying to look to cut costs, we know the first area they're going to try and do this is going to be in those services. And notwithstanding that, I know there was a bit of a move towards trying to re-onshore some of these services. The reality remains that I think it can be difficult, and regardless of where they're located, the number of levels of escalation for anything other than the simplest problem, it can just explode. I mean, I went through this myself earlier this year when my service stopped working for 4 days, and after 4 days, I just flipped providers because the providers couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't even respond. They couldn't give any sensible information about what was happening. And at a certain point, you go, well, why am I putting up with this? Yeah, we do have number portability, and I was just out of there. So yeah, and that was while it was a network fault that got me started, it was a customer service failure that got me finished.
I might have told this story before because we've been doing this podcast for 9 years this week. I figured it out, but I've some people complain that they're not always happy with the service from overseas call centers, but my experience once was the actual opposite. I had a problem where I was about to move house, so before I moved house, I had to change telco so then I could then move my service with me. Long crazy story. They somehow managed to screw it up in such a way that if you rang my house from a Telstra phone, it rang on one socket in the house, and if you rang my house from an Optus phone, it rang on the other socket in the house. And I spent
You're very special, Adam.
yes,
Clearly.
I spent 3 days ringing Telstra and Optus, being the catch
which
22. Yeah, exactly. Being told that you've got to talk to this department, but this department don't talk to people, and all this, and getting escalated and escalated. And what was it? Telstra kept trying to tell me that it was Optus's fault. I think they just trying to shift the blame all the time. And then eventually I got through to an overseas call center who went, oh, yeah, I can fix that. Click, press the button, fix it 5 minutes later. And then half an hour later, it broke again. So I rang back and got the Australians who tried to tell me that it was the other people's fault. And I said, no, bullshit. All you've got to do is press a button. The thing is, here in Australia, all you're interested in is blaming each other. This guy in India doesn't give a shit about your fights about Telstra and Optus. He just wanted to fix the problem, and it took him 5 minutes. So sometimes talking to someone who is removed from that tit for tat arguments between the major players can actually help.
And of course, this is why the TIO ultimately exists, because at a certain point, they just don't get it done. And so they're very clear that when if you've got to the TIO, you've been through this. Like, nobody's getting to the TIO with something that was easily solved.
Well, the TIO won't take a first response call if you've got a problem. You have to have tried to talk to the telco in question.
Absolutely.
Although, Adam, speaking of landline phones coming in, they still, and this is the astonishing stat here, they still have a separate section for complaints about landline services, and they've had more than 1,000 complaints in the last quarter about landline services.
Well, senior citizens have a lot of time on their hands. So
24% of these complaints are about no phone or internet service, which presumably means some of these people are still on dial-up.
Is dial-up even a thing anymore? I don't know, actually.
It's an interesting question to throw to the listeners. Are any of our listeners still on dial-up? And if so, have you finished the first episode of the podcast yet? It might have finished downloading by now.
PlayStation 4 versus Xbox One.
That's the one.
Of course, technically speaking, you could absolutely still have dial-up in those areas that are actually working off satellite, because they didn't get rid of the infrastructure in those places. So.
But whether the exchange is still supported, I don't know either, actually.
I think this is your challenge for a future episode, Adam. I want you to sign up for a dial-up plan.
And order ice cream.
Looking at the numbers as well by complaints per provider is, well, actually, it's not terribly surprising, because I think it largely breaks down by market share. It's Telstra, and then Optus, and then Vodafone, and then TPG, and then iiNet. I don't know why they bust iiNet out separately when it's part of TPG and when it's all part of Vodafone, and TPG eventually is all of those, of course. But do we think, apart from Optus shifting upwards, do we think that's ever going to massively change?
Not as it never changes the proportion, because the market shares are going to represent that. Within that, we did see some shifts in that stuff. So I think the Telstra complaints were actually down 20% quarter on quarter and 40% year on year. So despite that, in absolute terms, that means they probably are improving a little bit, but they're always going to have the biggest number of complaints, because they're always going to have the biggest number of customers, and the way that the market is structured, that's probably never going to change.
Well, that just about wraps up this week's episode of Vertical Hold. Thanks to Gus for joining us.
Pleasure, as always.
And Gus, it's time once again for you to face up to the patented, cat-friendly Vertical Hold 3 Questions of Doom. I will ask all 3 questions, as you know, and as you already know, you can answer them in any order you like. Where can people find your work online? where can they find you on what remains of social media? And our current big contentious question, without us having to engage a defamation lawyer, what's the worst job you've ever had?
So people can find my work online at finder.com.au. I am still hanging out on Twitter, GusWorldAU. I don't have the energy to go and set myself up somewhere else, so I'm going to stay on the hell site till it actually literally implodes.
He's riding the Titanic right to the seabed.
3 days and counting.
I've been really lucky in that nearly all my jobs have been in journalism. The only kind of university job I did was stuffing stuff in envelopes, but that was great. That's a brilliant university job because you don't have to deal with the public and you've just got these really simple tasks that don't use any brain power. So the worst job I've ever had was early on in my freelance career. I was hired on a contract position to help launch a weekly IT title, and I'm not going to say anymore because Alex says I don't want to get sued. And that was fine in that I'd said I'm only going to come in for a couple of months and help you set up. But then they asked, I think a month in, they said, "Oh, could you write all the news content for the first 6 months?"
Yeah, no worries.
And I was like, okay, yeah, you people don't understand how news
Mystic
works.
Gus divines the news.
Well, so in this day and age, it's like, you know what? Probably I could take a Daily Mail approach to it, and I could probably have made an educated guess on some of them. But like, I was happy when that contract finished because I just thought, okay, there's a level of fantasy that even I can't indulge.
Well, while people are indulging their fantasies, we won't judge. You can catch us online at Vertical Hold AU on Twitter, at the Vertical Hold Facebook page, and on the web at verticalhold.com.au.
And as always, thanks everyone for dropping by. Thanks for your great reviews. Thanks for helping us spread the word in 2022.
And if any of you are still on dial-up, let us know.
Vertical Hold is proudly brought to you by Aussie Broadband, changing the game with their award-winning network and Australian-based support. Yeah.
It's quite a good monitor. It's just nobody wanted like an ultra-wide monitor because you can only use them for a few things. But it turns out having a run sheet one
Like
side...
clubbing a man to death with.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's always useful. But, I have an alibi, so it's all good.